Okay, I'd like to call to order the January 12th, 2017 meeting of the Bellingham Planning Commission. It's our first meeting of the year. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to ask everybody to silence electronic devices, cell phones or laptops if you got them. Just please make sure their volume's turned off. Heather, will you call the roll, please?
Wally Taishi.
Here.
Tom Grinstead. Here. Steve Brooks.
Here.
Lisa Anderson. Here. Garrett O'Brien, Jeff Brown, and Phyllis McKee have been excused.
All right, so we've got a small group of us tonight, but we do have enough of us to approve the 3 sets of minutes that were sent out by Heather for the last few meetings in 2016. So unless anyone's got any objection or comment on the minutes, we could just do a assent to approval through some head nods. So let's do all 3 unless, Tom, do you have a question? Yes, but we're going to do it anyway. We come up with 3. Okay, so the minutes are approved from those 3 meetings. So we're going to have an opportunity for public comment. This will be comment unrelated to the topic of tonight's meeting. Tonight's meeting is about the subdivision ordinance. So if you'd like to talk about anything else other than the subdivision ordinance, you can stand where Kathy Bell is standing and speak to us for 3 minutes on whatever topic is interesting to you. We will provide an opportunity for comment on the topic at the end of the meeting. So if you do want to talk about the subdivision ordinance, you can do that later when we'll have a public comment period specific to that topic. So there's a few folks in the audience. Would anyone like to speak in the public comment period?
Yeah, I will move.
Yeah. Okay. So would you like to, sir? I think he might have been waving it off. Or did you want to speak, sir? Oh, okay. Come on up. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And just for the record, please state your name and address.
Name and what else?
Address.
Address?
Yeah.
Okay. Mark Ambler, 4845 Guide Meridian. I really was actually here for the part that got canceled, the marijuana portion. So I guess I'd just like to pose a question that I don't know, maybe at some point you guys can answer. Like, it was, the agenda said that it's for the consideration of amendments to the BMC regarding proposed final rules and regulations for all marijuana operations. Like, is there more information, like what proposed changes are going to be brought up so that we can kind of take a look at that? And really, that was my only question. So.
Thank you. And luckily, Kurt Nabfeld is here, and I'm pretty sure you can answer that question, right?
Yeah, I can.
Okay,
there will be additional materials available on that. We are just finalizing some questions that the Planning Commission had asked us to evaluate before we come back with it. So we are doing that, and we will have additional information on the our website. I think we've pushed it to February 2nd is when we're coming back, and so about 2 weeks before February 2nd we'll have that information on the web for you.
And then we'll have at that February 2nd meeting there'll be an opportunity to comment as well if you'd like to come back at that meeting and make comment on that topic. We'll have a whole section on that. Yeah, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak in the public comment period? Okay, see no one, will close that. And as Kurt just mentioned, we've postponed the marijuana hearing to February 2nd, 2017. And with that, we will move into our work session, which is on the subdivision ordinance. Kathy, thank you.
Thank you. Kathy Bell, Planning Department. So we're here today to initiate a more in-depth work session. I feel like we've been having many work sessions on this topic, but it is important to the City of Bellingham, so I believe that our time is well spent. And just to give you a quick little background, the current regulations were adopted in 1997, which makes them 20 years old. And they have received minor modifications over the course of those 20 years. The good news is they're not as old as our land use development ordinance, but we're hoping to bring these up for consideration. We began this update process in 2014 with an introduction to the Planning Commission. It was a public hearing, and essentially what we did at that hearing is we presented the history, the background, kind of the fundamental basis of subdivisions, why they're important, what they look like, how we regulate them. It was a really like Subdivisions 101. And if any planning commissioner would like a recourse on that and to sit down, and I know I've met with Commissioner Crooks to go through some detail on that, more than happy. This is a very technical aspect of the Bellingham Municipal Code, so questions are definitely encouraged. We certainly don't want you to think you understand something that maybe you think you do, because it is technical. So we started in 2014, and we got direction from the Planning Commission at that time, and then we spent the better part of 2015 and 16 going through technical groups, steering committees, Planning Commission subcommittees, and we came back to the Planning Commission as a whole at the end of 2016 to ask for further direction to make sure that all the work that we've done up until that time, if we could proceed to where we are proposing today, and that is a draft ordinance. So every time we come forward, it's a little bit more advanced. It's still not perfect. There's still a lot of room for questions. There's a lot of room for improvement, but there's a lot of good ideas within it that are worthy of discussion, and we felt that it was time to come forward. So as the ordinance before you today is proposed as a repeal and replace, and what effectively that means is that the existing subdivision ordinance would be repealed in its entirety and replaced with a brand new ordinance. So you do not have the luxury of seeing red lines, because there are no red lines, because the entire document would be a red line. So what we will do throughout this process is to help you understand what the major significant changes are of the existing regulations as compared to what is proposed. And that could be brand new opportunities, it could be amended, and even those that have been removed, and to be able to have those discussions with you. As I mentioned, we have some fairly old and dated provisions, and I think if you look at the next two bullets, when we talk about changing landscape and greenfield versus infill opportunities, they somewhat go together. In 20 years, City of Bellingham has grown significantly in population. Our needs are different, our wants are different. We have limited greenfield opportunities, which is development predominantly that we're seeing on the fringes or the outer portions of the city that do not currently have development on them. They tend to be larger parcels under common ownership, versus infill opportunities. We're really starting to see infill development in the city of Bellingham, and that takes the place of either further advancing a lot that isn't fully developed to zoning, to complete redevelopment of a site. And part of the process of what we did in going through the ordinance that is before you is we really looked at our lean methods, and we really tried to eliminate waste. We really tried to streamline processes where we could. We eliminated some processes that we felt weren't necessary. Unfortunately, we did have to add some, but those are state mandated, so I wouldn't really call those waste, but they are what they are. And that leads into the next one is one of the reasons we are taking this opportunity is there are quite a bit of, there's holes in our existing ordinance that are not compliant with state law, and this is an opportunity to take that compliance, to take that opportunity to come in compliance. And we're trying to look at better business processes, and then part that goes with lean, and we're trying to work within the process, both for the public and the developers, to try to come up with a better process and better outcome. So our key changes. We are looking for compliance to state subdivision regulations. We are proposing some development standards that deal specifically with infill opportunities as well as greenfield opportunities. We're looking to streamline our process, And the two processes that we are changing primarily or most significantly are the lot line adjustment and the binding site plan processes. And for many of our subdivision processes, we are establishing decision criteria because currently, with the exception of the lot line adjustment, our subdivision types don't have real clear decision criteria. So this is in help for both the applicants for a predictable process, for the public for a predictable process, and for the hearing examiner to render good decisions. And another opportunity that we're taking is what I call outsourcing associated titles. So rather than have street standards in the subdivision ordinance and street standards in the land use ordinance and street standards in Title 13, which is where most of them live, we are going to be referencing street standards, sewer, water, stormwater requirements in critical areas. We're outsourcing them to the codes or the chapters of the BMC that are most relevant to those. So not changing content. So again, when we're looking at the old code and looking at the new code, you may say, well, where is this street requirement? It's no longer here. You're correct, but it lives somewhere else. And with that, I'll take the opportunity to let the Planning Commission and the public know that Public Works Department will be coming forward relatively soon. We're hoping that the timing of revision to Title 13, which is streets, will come forward fairly close to the same time that we come back for a public hearing before the Planning Commission. So we're really trying to integrate these and bring these two entities or these two chapters of the code together because they are relevant and they are related. That's actually an exciting opportunity. So here's what I propose to the Planning Commission. We've discussed this with Chair Mr. Taishi to go through this document. I believe it is 46 pages, which is a reduction of our existing code by 9 pages. I would like to proceed with the review process first of going through the general provisions. And the reason of going through the general provisions first is, again, it kind of gives that overarching code authority and important elements that we consider holistically for the subdivision ordinance, and it provides some unique opportunities. The other is to go through the process chapters. And again, what I mean by that is we've taken a lot of the standards, if not all of the standards, out of the specific chapters dealing with lot line adjustment, short plat, preliminary plats, and of the alike, and we've put them in the relevant section of the code, which I would like to discuss last, which is standards. And that's where we believe we'll have the most discussion. It's going to be the most in-depth, and that's really going to be the question of asking more, what does this change do to lot size? What does it do to lot shape? What does it do to neighborhood character? That's when you really start looking at how do the regulations affect character, design, and what are they going to look like on the ground? The specific chapters primarily deal with process. There's a few exceptions, but they primarily deal with process from application to decision. I think going through this process too will provide that opportunity to slowly introduce, again, the lot line adjustment, the short plat, the preliminary plat. It will help us understand and be reminded of what public involvement opportunities there are, who the decision makers are, and what the effect of the decisions are. So it kind of, again, is an overarching review and then going down into the specifics. It seems backwards, but I think the general understanding will be helpful to all of us to go through this. And then when we start to talk about the specifics, we can talk about a lot line adjustment, we can talk about a short plat, and it should make a lot more sense. So if we can all generally agree with that review process, I would like to just give one more thing before we jump in, and that's the layout of the subdivision ordinance. One of the differences, if you look back to the existing Title 18, is that there is somewhat of a different layout. And again, that's not to hide or to confuse changes. It's really meant to be more for the user. the person who is using the document. So we have reorganized it a little bit. We've taken the lot standards and the infrastructure requirements and we've put those to the front so that that's where most people are going to go. And then they can design and read all the development standards from that. And we have tried, where applicable, to provide consistent headings. So each chapter has consistent headings. And approval process, the approval process is A to B, B to C, and you just go through the process. Our ordinance right now does not clearly define that. So what this is really meant to be is also like as a user guide, so someone can understand, they make application, this is the next step, until this is what you need to do to get to a decision. So it's intended to be a user guide as well, which we don't believe our existing ordinance does as good of a job as it could. And then again, what I mentioned earlier is really distinguishing between process and standards and trying to keep them separated as much as we can within the ordinance itself.
Before we get started?
Yeah, so for my general recommendation, I would like to proceed under this review process, and if we can all agree to that, then I'm going to sit down and we'll start working.
So I met with Kathy and we talked a little bit about that, and I agreed that, and with Rick and Kurt, that would be a good way to tackle it for the exact reason that Kathy said, is that if we get a better understanding of each of the different types of subdivisions, that it'll help us when we start looking at the more meaty stuff like the design standards, so we're not looking at those in a vacuum. I think all of us will gain a better understanding about each of those processes first, and then just unless anyone has any concerns with that, I agree with that approach. And I'd just like to add that this is not our only work session. There's only 4 of us. So we'll work on this for maybe till 9. And then I think we should just call it wherever we're at. And I think it would benefit everybody for, the full body to be here, particularly when we talk about standards. Even if we get there, let's say it takes us 30 minutes, right? And we get to yeah, that was a joke, to standards, we're just going to stop. We'll wait till everybody's back to kind of have that discussion. And I think that staff thought that was a good approach too.
Yeah.
So, yes, Tom.
I have one general question on this repeal and replace. I understand it's council that's going to do that. And is it your intent that it happen sequentially, I guess, so at the same meeting, so we're not left with a vacuum at any stage?
Yes, if I could respond. Typically, the ordinance would say the following sections are repealed in total and replaced by the following. So it's timely, and there'll be an effective date. Unless council chooses to, typically it's after a period of time. So there might be an application comes in the next day that would vest, after it was done. But usually that's not the case.
And then one last thing is, I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but what Kathy and staff are looking for are, questions we have. This doesn't have to be kind of a yay or nay on it. We're not saying what we think about any of this stuff in terms of yes or no. It's more just questions, clarifications, trying to understand it better. If there are specific provisions or sections that any of you have real interest in or want more information on or have a specific comment, then definitely we can provide that, and that'll help them kind of make revisions. I think, Rick, you called it version 1.2, right? We'll come back with something a little bit revised. So, Lisa?
So I completely agree. I think it's good to frame and then also be able to deal with the things that I think that will be more concerning for neighborhoods and property owners. And if we can frame everything so that there's a deeper understanding of how some of these changes are, especially I imagine eventually bringing forward like examples, that will be useful. But I would like, if we do have, we're done in 30 minutes, that if we do have questions about some of the content, about some of the standards, just to have a better understanding, I would assume, instead of just putting opinion out there, just for the clarification, I would assume that would be useful to touch into it if we have time.
Sure, yeah, and if we get through it in a timely fashion, we can definitely do that. And if not, we'll have that opportunity definitely at the next meeting. Yeah.
Because I will at least mention that when we get to the standards, there will be a lot more examples. We may take the opportunity to actually draw, although maybe Rick will do that part because I don't draw very well, but to draw what they look like and what it means. To read some of this in black and white is very challenging, and we need to be able to show what is anticipated with that. So there's a much bigger presentation proposed than what we have here for the process portion.
Just a comment for if public is watching, some people have, they're invested to watch these things in the evening. Some of the one of the sessions I attended that you provided as part of the work group, the subgroup, it was really helpful when you got up on the board and was able to really kind of draw things out, because mentally when I hear certain things coming from not, like with my previous, activities within neighborhoods, my mind is going here, what this means, because of my somewhat limited understanding. I know some of it, but I just didn't understand some of the nuances. So it was really helpful how you framed some of that, and some of the concerns I had, you were able to really outline it. So if anyone is really reading this, which is available online, and hearing bits and pieces, I think further sessions, if you're able to really frame it, and because I know I had a much better understanding of some of the benefits that at first I was concerned about. Not that I don't have some additional, wonderment of some of this and how it's impact, but it was very helpful. So to kind of, let things develop as you're forming your opinion is,
Great.
I think, would
And
be
thank
good.
you. Yep.
Great, thank you. That's a good point.
Okay.
All right.
So for those of you that are in the audience watching at home in the comforts of your warm home, this is the City of Bellingham website that you can go to and follow along. And what I have clouded in the bottom of the screen is the draft ordinance and the PowerPoint for January 12th, and there are links to there to have the opportunity to call these documents up. So I will leave this up on the screen if that's so when people come in, they...
If I might, before we get started, just to clarify, this is a clean ordinance, but from this point forward, since it's sort of the benchmark, you'll start seeing line in, line out as things are changed. So you'll be able to track how it evolves as it's developed. That
Great.
make sense?
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. So, Kathy, how do you want to handle it? Do you want to kind of go, do you want to go through each subsection, or do you want to and ask us if we have questions or explain them all? I mean, some of them are pretty basic and some of them are more complicated, or just to open it up to discussion. What do you think is the most effective way to do that?
I think it can, I think it can be fairly organic as we go through. The PowerPoint information that I've provided gives not only some key headings, but within those headings, what the significant changes have been. That's not all of the changes, but they are some of the most significant changes, whether mostly new items and or revised items. So, I mean, if we want, we can go through generally, or if we have questions, I can entertain it. A lot of that will depend on how prepared you are to understand the topic, or if you want to be, sort of explained what the intent is. And again, we're definitely open. And if Rick, if you have any...
Yeah, I might suggest we just start and work through. If anyone has any questions, you might want to give one or two sentences for each what the purpose was. Some are self-evident.
Yeah.
Let's just keep working our way along. And if we run to a point, it might lead the discussion to figure out a little more.
Okay, I like that. That's okay, yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, first chapter is 1804, General Provisions. You will notice that this is not page numbered. However, each section does have a section number to it. So we were able to not completely freak out about that whole situation. And they do have lane numbers. So we hit 2 of the 3. The next one coming through will have page numbers. So didn't want to, I know you have markups over the one that came to you, and I certainly didn't want to interrupt, anything that you had on a new document. So the first is pretty general. It's the title, 010. That's just a standard statement that's in most ordinances. The purpose statement is really the basis and the heart and soul of why we're doing this. And this talks about, the general planning policies of health, safety, and general welfare. It talks about furthering the goals and policies of the comprehensive plan. It talks about the orderly extension of public infrastructure. It's really hitting the key elements of the subdivision and the subdivision process and what the outcome is to achieve, what this document is to achieve. And most importantly, refers back to the state subdivision regulations, which are in Chapter 5817 of the RCWs. So this is a section that can be broadened. It can be minimized. We use it as staff when we have question, when we're looking for interpretation. If there's a code that isn't quite clear given a proposal, you can have the clearest code there is, but sometimes the proposals come in and you have to start to ask those questions. We can go back to the purpose statement and to see, does it do this? Does it comply with this section? So it's meant to be broad, it's meant to be a guiding statement within, but it sets the overall framework. 030 is the authority relationship to state law. This really just, it really takes you back to, again, the reason we're doing this, and that is because the state mandates us to do these provisions. And under the applicability section, which is 040, I think we could, Kurt, I think we could probably put this up now. Do you want to do that?
I think we can give the folks here copies.
Oh, you want to do that? Okay.
See the website.
Okay. There's that means I have to put my glasses on.
And I would encourage you, planning commissioners, if any questions arise, just stop Kathy and let's take the time to discuss them.
So the applicability essentially just goes to, again, it's for that the regulation shall apply to basically every type of subdivision within this ordinance. Compliance, this is a new section that we have added, and we felt that it was important, and the most important aspect of this is C, which is 050C. And the reason for this, while it may sound simple or fundamental, is there's times that we've been before the hearing examiner when we're looking at setbacks and with like existing infill short plats, and they're looking for subdivision variance from setback requirements. Right now, the subdivision ordinance doesn't reference back to Title 20, or for that matter, any other chapter within the Bellingham Municipal Code. And there's times that the creation of lots is one aspect, but you still have to comply with all the other regulations. So the subdivision doesn't give you the power to come out of compliance with the other city code provisions. So that's really what this chapter or this section is meant to do, is to recognize that this is not a standalone document of the only thing that you look at, that you must look at it in relation to essentially the entire Bellingham Municipal Code. So we felt that that was an important aspect to bring forward. While it seems intuitive, if it's not in code, we've run into some interesting questions from that perspective.
I have one question on compliance, on B, which makes sense to me, suggesting that, you can't create less compliant lots. I'm thinking specifically about lot line adjustments, where you might have two lots that don't meet the requirements for, like, say, lot size, so they'd be non-conforming. And does this compliance statement restrict our ability to engage in a lot line adjustment between non-conforming lots? And I noticed in the lot line adjustment section, there's some language on that, and maybe we'll get there at that point, but I just want to make sure that we don't make it impossible for people to resolve property line disputes on non-conforming lots.
So the intent in that statement, when it says no lot line adjustment, so we're on lines 12 and 13, or
Yeah.
vacation of land authorized by this title. So if it's authorized by this title,
So
and
if
it
later
allows
it
you to
allows
do,
it, then
yes,
this would
exactly.
cover it. So we can talk about whether or not that protects us enough when we get to the
Yes.
specific. Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Highlighted that until I got down through some of the others.
Yeah, and then you see it.
So moving on to 060, completion of public infrastructure. This is one of those areas where we have removed it from one aspect or one section of the subdivision ordinance, and we've moved it up front. Again, it's a compliance issue, but this is more of a timing, and it's a little bit more of a process. And state law says that we shall provide the opportunity for bonding of infrastructure, and this is in the subdivision ordinance where this provision is saying that you must complete your infrastructure or there is an opportunity for bonding. How you do that will be in Title 13, but the state provisions say that we have to provide that opportunity in our subdivision regulations. So this is providing the opportunity, but if there's criteria, those are some further things that we're going to talk about in Title 13 when those provisions come forward for infrastructure. Which is making me think that this might be an appropriate place for a reference to Title 13. Possibly, it's something that we can look at. So again, that's part of that outsourcing of code. The 070 is the administrative officer. And again, this just defines that it's the director or the designee. All ordinances have an administrative officer identified. And it states in here that the director, when the director gives recommendations and when they have the ability to make decisions and all of that. 080 is an interesting section. And those are the exemptions. State law currently has exemptions, and we felt rather than list every single one of them, and per your direction last time, that we would reference state law exemptions, and then we would add additional that are unique to the city of Bellingham. So we are proposing 5 of those. B is a process that we already implement, and it actually is part of the land use ordinance, but there's always that confusion of creation of lots and where are you creating lots, and where the subdivision ordinance says that's where you create lots. So the legal lots, as you can see, we're outsourcing it into Title 20. So there's no question that if you can legally establish a lot in Title 20, it will be a legal lot. So we're just trying to avoid any confusion from that perspective. C talks about the public land acquisition, and we currently have this now, but it's a bit modified. And the public land acquisition is the Parks Department goes out and will purchase land. Well, the land that they purchase isn't always uniform, and it doesn't always have straight lines, and it's really for a purpose and for a need. And so what this says is it recognizes that those situations will happen and that it shouldn't have to go through the formal subdivision process because they're not. It's very unique, and it's for a very specific reason. And condemnation is somewhat like that, when the city goes out and condemns property for right-of-way acquisition and processes like that. So these are really meant for more of the public actions that are taken. And again, it's just not a uniform subdivision. It's not for the purpose of creating land for development in the sense of what we talk about neighborhood character and creating those uniform lots for density purposes.
Kathy, what about land banking? City wants to know that at some potential point down the road, they're going to need a certain amount of property. Is there anything restricting them from getting it now and not doing anything with it for about 10 to 15 years?
What specifically do you, I'm not following the question specifically for land banking. In what context?
Buying it ahead of time to save money and preventing taking the property from private property owner to protect the city so they don't run into a higher cost in 10 years or 15 years or whatever.
Are you like thinking the city will go out and do a subdivision in order to purchase a piece of property that may in the future be utilized for a park or saved? Is that what?
And taking it by eminent domain for the pure fact that they're going to save money by doing it now, there's no need now in acquiring it by condemnation where it's not going to be utilized in 15, 20 years.
Can you do that for a condemnation?
You have to have a public purpose,
Yeah.
and it would have to meet the tests. We have a whole body of law that deals with condemnation, and the city's justifying it. It can be contested. Takings are not illegal. Takings without compensation are illegal. So then it becomes the issue of full compensation for it. I think I would say one could segregate a portion of a property that could be for a variety of uses, and as long as it was justified for public use, you probably could use that acquisition. So yeah, you would, let's say it's 40 acres, you only needed 20, you have a good public purpose that a plan said we're going to need that, don't need it right now, but we know we're going to need it in 20 years. You can go forward. I should note that for the most part, you never reach final condemnation. In most cases, cities start a process of negotiation, which allowed by law to solve. In most circumstances, you do usually find an agreement based on assessed values and survey appraisals. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
E is a manufactured home park. Interestingly enough, in our plan designated areas, we do allow mobile home parks, and this does give them the opportunity to come in and have their lease pads be fee simple for ownership purposes. This is also, I will note, a provision in the state, but we have added this specifically for the Bellingham zoning code, so there's a nexus. So we wanted to tailor it so it's a little bit more unique to Bellingham, so we've taken the state provision and added a little bit to it. And the other divisions made by court order, I joked some time ago in my youthfulness in my career and came across a division that had been made by court order where the judge said, this is the property line. And I began to argue with our attorneys that they can't do that. And his response was, you go tell the judge that. So rather than have that question come up, we felt it would be a good thing to put. And it's not expressly listed as an outright allowance or prohibition. So it happens, we're proposing to allow it. And it's a level above our government, I guess you could say. And we encourage anytime we know about it for them to engage in a lot line adjustment, just so that it is of legal record and it's there for public notice. And when we know about it, we've had success in talking to the attorneys with that, because that's one of the things that they put in their quiet title or the judge puts into their quiet titles that they must also execute a lot line adjustment. So it's just in those situations, we've already known what people have gone through, the judge has made a decision, we're not going to question it, is effectively the summary of that.
I should note that exemptions are not unusual in subdivision codes. Counties, rural counties especially, have a number of exceptions for very large divisions, more than 40 acres, for allowing folks to live on family farms, for children to have building sites on that and not violate the laws. All those can be codified within the provisions of 5817.
The re-subdivision restriction, it's a very interesting provision that the state has put into law, and we have had a few recent situations where we have had to seek outside legal advice as to what did the state mean. And it was interesting because they were somewhat mixed as well. And effectively what this section says is that if you have a piece of property and you short plat it, you can short plat up to a total of 4 lots on that parent parcel within 5 years. That's easy because you can count, you can look at the time. What's more difficult of that is if you subdivide it into 2 lots, then you come back and you further subdivide, say, the larger lot within 5 years. Well, that now has to go through the preliminary plat process. Again, that's very clear. But it talks about ownership, and it talks about, in the concern that we came up with is that the intent of this provision was not to prevent or to give the property owners an ability to not provide those infrastructure requirements that would have otherwise been required. So effectively what this does is if you further subdivide more than 5 lots within 4 years, you must, for your infrastructure purposes, look at the parent parcel and provide whatever infrastructures would be required at that time. So for example, 5 lots requires 3/4 street improvements with its curb gutter sidewalk. To do it any other way, there would be a portion of that lot that would not have curb gutter sidewalk. And so it is a way to circumvent the code or to go around it, and we're trying to prevent that from happening. Does it happen often? No, but when it does happen, we always revisit this issue and we ask the question, well, we don't have to ask that question anymore. That's the purpose behind this.
Was this language in the old code, or were we just relying on the state law before?
Both.
Okay,
We have modified this to say, so starting on line 29, it says a preliminary plat decision under this provision shall be conditioned appropriately to require the installation of public infrastructure improvements across the full frontage of the original short plat boundaries.
So that's there to catch, that's that catch you're talking
Exactly.
about. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the stepping back, the key issue here is not to use a series of short plats to circumvent what a long plat would require.
Lisa.
Who would be financially responsible? I'm seeing scenarios where someone's divided out, sold, and then somebody else wants to divide out, but now they weren't the original owners of the parent, the larger section. So where would the responsibility, if they get to that 5th plat, who's going to have to provide all that infrastructure? Because that would be pretty costly.
The applicant of who is doing that additional development would need to do we would call them off-site street improvements because they go beyond the boundaries of their subdivision proposal.
And the basis for that is subdivision is not a right, it's a privilege. So in essence, if you're going to go and do it, you'd have to make the cost rather than being something inherent for all of the subsequent property owners.
So as far as like right-of-way situations where the 3 owners of the other lots, and now you have to go in and put more infrastructure, which may possibly change some of the property of those lots? Is it a matter of that they have to get buy-in or approval from those people, maybe through compensation, in order to be able to then do it? Or while it's being platted, is there land that is specified that should further development happen, that they're entitled in order to have right-of-way in order to put in those amenities?
The right-of-way, I'm thinking of a situation, I can't think of a situation where existing platted lots would not already front or have access to a street, so that right-of-way would already exist. And yes, if there were additional right-of-way needs or property needs for additional right-of-way, then that would be the applicant's responsibility to go obtain those. And that would be the general course of business.
It's a good question. This happens where there's an undeveloped right-of-way with perhaps just a rolling surface, no sidewalks. A larger project goes in and is conditioned to do all of the sidewalk to make the connections. The larger project gets back. If it's in the right-of-way, that's in an area that's already set for that. So it may affect the adjacent property owners. They may or may not like it, but that's inevitability. It goes part and parcel with the right-of-way being established. So they have the right to build it, and the public is served by getting the full improvement.
And in theory, if you had a large, like a small subdivision, and then a big vacant property behind it, you would probably make sure that when that small subdivision occurred, you would get an appropriate right-of-way width to accommodate that future. That's what we'd have to trust that the staff would recognize that and say, we need 60 feet of right-of-way here because these guys are going to do this one day.
So you're kind of getting to where I was trying to go, was that, is there like that looking towards to ensure something that happens? Because if the owner of that property doesn't do it, we could have an area that could be landlocked, which would be great developable land, yet the owners of the other property is saying you didn't, achieve a right-of-way, so you can't get it. And now we have a section of property that maybe could not be developed into further subdivision. So is there, like when we're looking at approving something, is there any kind of mechanism that would say, no, because of this large parcel potential future development, you would need to put something in as a right-of-way for future potential, because it would be, if we're looking at infill, we wouldn't want 5 acres somewhere to be isolated without being able to really divide it out because there's just one house there.
Yep. That will be in 1808-020, which we will talk about. And I will say our current ordinance does not do as great of a job as it could to address those issues. We certainly, to the best of my knowledge, have never made a parcel landlocked. It may already be landlocked, but we're definitely going to bring forward some recommendations for that. And that's in the standards we'll talk last. But yes, and thank you for that.
Yeah, just to clarify, this is really exactly the point that you were trying to get at, is making sure that we're looking forward and protecting the public. This ensures that we do get everything that the public needs when a property owner does come forward and subdivides. So.
And I apologize if I'm like,
No.
No, not at all.
There's a lot of components.
Nope.
I really read through a lot of notes,
Yeah.
but it's like,
Good
put the
question.
pieces together.
Moving on to 1804-100 consent to access. We have this general understanding that if there's an application made, that there's an inherent right to consent to access. And through my experience with subdivisions, we've effectively been denied access twice. And it did somewhat go back to, there weren't provisions in the code. Could we have pressed the issue? We probably could have. We chose not to. Now we didn't need to press that issue. The one thing I can say, and we brought forward to at least the subcommittee, and I don't recall if we brought forward to the commission as a whole, but this is a very condensed version. It potentially right now is meant to be a placeholder, is what our intent is. The attorney's office is looking at this. It is drastically different, much more open, and it's not as precise as what we find in the critical area ordinance, which is what we brought forward first in our first draft. And we got a lot of feedback from the steering committees and the Planning Commission subcommittee of, it seems overkill, like it's too much. So we've gone from nothing to too much, and now we're somewhere in the middle, but the attorney's office will be looking at it. I think the intent is clear as to why we need it. How we do it and how we say it, I think still needs some fine tuning.
When we discussed this, I thought there was some requests that when there's a request for access, the reason be explained, whether it be survey or whatever it is. And I thought that was going to be included from our discussion.
Yeah, I think I recollect that it originally started out saying that if you denied the access, your permit would be expired,
Yeah.
and everyone felt like that was too harsh, and then it was like, well, maybe it would result in a request for information or something.
Yeah.
I don't even know if that's necessary, but I do think that maybe, I just made a note that said with appropriate notice. I mean, it just seems like this is pretty broad, and maybe it's fair to just suggest that there's a notice provision or something, so that a landowner knows that someone's coming.
Yeah, I think those are good points.
And like you said, nobody really denies it, but that just creates the perception of like, that you're not, like, less of like an enforcement impression and more of like a collaborative impression. Hey, we're going to ask and you're going to say yes, and then we'll all be,
Right.
walking around the site together.
1804-110, which is model homes / units and preliminary plats. We will not be the first municipality to adopt something like this if the direction moves forward to include this. The opportunity here, and we have picked 6 model homes, and effectively what it does is it allows a contractor, while they're doing the infrastructure, to also get building permits to construct homes. But there's restrictions that go with that. They can't be sold. They need to be applied for by the developer, which gives the intent. And there needs to be something, some provisions in there that will also ensure that they're not habitable until such time that the subdivision is completed. Because we know what happens elsewhere, and we've talked to some of those other municipalities and it's working well, we believe that the models are out there and that it can be done. Currently, we allow them to apply for 1 building permit, and they can get approval for 1 building permit. From an economies of scale, or just, it's just not, it doesn't benefit them necessarily to get 1 home, but if they could get more homes, it makes more sense to build a few homes at a time rather than 1 at a time, and that we typically see that with our local developers. So we would like to move this forward. Obviously, behind the scenes, we'll need to be drafting and working on, those legal documents to ensure that these happen, but we believe that these code provisions are sufficient enough that should somebody apply for that we can draft the legal documents to ensure that these provisions are met.
Lisa?
I think from that meeting that I had attended, through this discussion, there was the concern that, whether funding falls through or something happens and that the subdivision doesn't ever go forward to full completion, or if there's some odd reason why everything was not finalized, that you could have buildings that are partially built and not habitable, and that could cause concern for the city as far as safety. Is there something maybe in another section, or should it be in here that, because I think we had mentioned something about a bond or something
Bonding.
that would be able to be utilized in order either to demolition or secure or, get a new developer or something. Is it somewhere further, or is it appropriate in here to add something?
I think this would be the appropriate place. The other thing to keep in mind, I guess, if we somewhat go back, when the recession first hit, we had a lot of, not necessarily the city of Bellingham, but there were a lot of half-completed construction projects, things that were, I'm sure in other parts of the country, a lot of half-finished buildings. Under those situations, should the property owner or the developer lose it, the bank carries on the ownership then, and then the bank then becomes responsible, because all of these documents would go to the heirs to sign as successors. So it's not like it's in no man's land of no ownership and no responsibility. And in part, that's what the bank would be taking on, because they would be, they would need, my assumption would be, when they take money out to build the homes, the banks are loaning these, and there has to be some sense of that obligation. So I guess in some part, my question is leading to that thinking on the fly, is whether or not all parties with a vested interest should be signing that, which would include the bank. So then there's a level of knowledge there that in the event that that happens, and wondering if that addresses your concern.
Because I think part of, you know, going from one model up to 6, there was that thought process that there's a trade-off, because they're getting a lot more, but with getting more, there needed to be some security, something, so that, because even if a bank was to repossess, you know, to go through the process of, you know, it's a failed, you know, business attempt, that builder goes some way, there's time before the bank can get something else in place to continue. And so it's that time that those unattended, half-built buildings are sitting there, that it's going to cost the city money. So I'm more concerned about something like that, because 6 houses is definitely more to worry about than 1. So if there's something that could be strengthened there, whether it's the bank signing on, or that there's a bond that would be appropriate for just ensuring that the process and cost that the city will take on as a process, you know, to pursue the bank and everything to get things going or finished, that the taxpayer is not holding the bill for those additional costs.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We'll look into it.
It might be something where we could note the director may condition to ensure that the projects will be completed. And secondly, it needs to be proportionate to the size of the project. If there's 6 lots, they're not going to be 6 model homes.
I had that same question. Like, if you did a 6-lot plat, could you just build it all out? Lisa, I agree with your concern. It's a good concern, and I just don't know if a bond, the city's not in the business of building houses, so if you called the bond, I mean, would the city ever really, like, call a bond on a house and go finish it? Is that practical? Probably not. You have the public facility contract requirement, which includes bonding, but the city can go finish roads and infrastructure much more easily.
If anything,
I'm
we'd
just
end up
thinking
demolition.
Yeah, so maybe, like maybe that's a better
some
solution.
kind of security deposit, something,
It's a
because
good
there
idea.
could possibly be cost that goes to the taxpayer, even if it's an increased law enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, there's going to be something there, or securing the property with fencing, whatever
And it's not
it
even
is.
that big of a cost. If a developer had to buy a bond for a demo of 4 homes, that's not a huge burden on them financially.
No, it's a question of whether or not a lending institute would also
Back
allow
that
the
up.
lending
Yeah.
with a bond to demolish. I mean, so those are things that we will
Yeah. That's
definitely
a good
check
question.
on to see likelihood. Application and fees, this exists in many areas right now within the code, I think almost within every chapter, so we've taken it out of every chapter and basically just says that you must file application and you must pay the appropriate fees. One of the other things that it does say in the last paragraph, starting on line 27, is we're getting at ownership here. And ownership, like the Lake Whatcom watershed, which is where this comes from, is what is ownership. And what we had back in, I'd say, the 90s is we had a property owner that owned a significant amount of land and continued to do lot line adjustment after lot line adjustment and then short plat after short plat. And so effectively he was able for probably 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, do subsequent series of 4-lot short plats on separate lots. So the density would have afforded urban level of development standards, curb gutter sidewalks, stormwater, and all of that. But because and all the property was under common ownership. So in that context, we felt, but didn't have the opportunity to bring that into a site development so we could really look at the impacts and, you know, where the road should go, where the improvements should go, and all of, you know, all of those considerations that, Lisa, that you brought up earlier as well. So we're looking at ownership. I actually found almost the identical definition in other codes, which they either stole from Kurt's wisdom or something. So it's not like we're far reaching. It is out there in other situations as well.
I have oh, go ahead.
This goes to your earlier point about us looking overarching at the connectivity and subsequent development patterns and being mindful of that. So in a sense, this is straight to that.
I had a question. Is this only apply to short subdivisions? Or does it apply to all subdivisions of land? Because it starts out on line 27, it says any application for the division of land, and then on line 29 it says shall be included in the short subdivision application. And I was just curious if the intent was to capture all subdivisions or just short subdivisions.
Oh, no,
in your
it should be
guys'
all.
Should be all?
Yeah. So
I understand the intent that you just described, but I'm a little bit nervous about this because I was thinking about what if I'm a property owner and I have a 10-acre property and a 50-acre property and they're right next to each other, and I want to do, and it's 5,000 square foot zoning, and so I could fit in 1 acre, I could fit 8 lots, right? And so with a 10-acre parcel, I could do 80 lots, and I want to come in with an 80-lot subdivision. Are you going to make that developer incorporate that adjacent 50-acre parcel that's in common ownership and do the entire thing all at once? And how do we prevent that? Because when I read this, I read all contiguous parcels in common ownership have to be developed together. And I get it on that, what you described, Kathy, that like we're not going to let people go 4, then 4, then 4 and kind of cheat. But if we're too broad, it might discourage people from developing. Like that guy who has 10 might not want to do a 10-acre development because he doesn't have the chops to do 60 or even 2 10s, 20. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that and what impact that might have on some of the bigger contiguous parcels. That's really what we're trying to accomplish.
you think it may be more applicable to just short plats. Right now, currently, that's how the code is written, and this is what the existing code says, is the total property owned by the applicant, which is contiguous to the parcel being subdivided, shall be accurately indicated on the drawing, and all contiguous property under common ownership shall be included in the plat. This is only under the short plat section.
I mean, maybe it's necessary in long plats too. I'm just worried about like the bigger lots and how that might discourage development if it's too broad. I know we don't have a lot of those kinds of situations probably, but I was just kind of thinking about this provision. I know people use LLCs these days to separate properties and not develop them, and it sounds like we're attacking that a little bit too. And that's a separate issue, I guess, but I see a lot of people who own 2 big pieces and they put one in an LLC or give one to their kid and then develop one of them, and it sounds like this would prohibit that from happening.
But the reality of that is just because you own parcels, and if they are to be included in the application, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to bring forward a development plan for the whole thing either. I mean, you could identify, and we talked about this in one of our drawings, and that's going to somewhat lead to phasing a little bit and how projects are phased. And that doesn't mean that they may need to come in with a whole for planning purposes, but that doesn't mean they need to develop the whole, and there's nothing that would preclude them from coming back and doing a new application on the remainder or the balance of that site.
Could that generate the risk of, say, like a significant frontage improvement? Like if you came in and said, okay, I'm going to do this development, I'm going to leave this huge leftover chunk as a reserve tract effectively, might the city say, well, we want you to do a wetland delineation over the whole property, even though you're not even touching that 30 acres over there? You're going to have to spend a ton of money to delineate that, or we're going to make you improve your road frontage along your entire property now because it's part of the plat, and they might add 1,000 feet of road that they won't use for, who knows, 5, 10, 20 years. That's kind of what I'm concerned about, is where does the city stop reaching on that when the rubber hits the road and someone applies, and it has to be equitable to the development. And so maybe that's addressed and I'm not seeing it, but I worry a little bit about what I'm worried about is making it hard to do the smaller subdivision if you own a big piece next to it through either the implementation of regulations and improvement requirements, or just scaring people off because of the potential cost increase.
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of things going on here. First is we want disclosure. No one disputes that. We want to understand your adjacent properties. The second is, I think we as a community want to be sure we have looked at the cumulative effect so that we don't, we have a road that ends in a cul-de-sac that for that adjacent property needed to be a through road. You know, we'd be kicking ourselves because then someone would come back in and say, well, I can't make a through road, so I need a lesser standard to access my. I think we need to spell out what we're looking for here, and it might be a section, its own section, just saying review for cumulative effects. And it looks at how does this fit in? Are there adjacent properties that are owned? It may not require it to be platted, but it may require it to be disclosed at the time of application. And a legitimate question for us is, okay, you're doing this, how are you going to get to this parcel now?
Yeah, I agree.
Or how are you going to serve it, or where's the water going to be, or where's the trail going, those kind of things.
Perhaps setting aside the appropriate amount of right-of-way so that the further development could happen as part of the plan, and not necessarily putting the money out forward to develop that right-of-way, but ensuring, like my concern, that the land wasn't set aside, so now you've got this little island in the back. So I think that might address your concern.
Yeah, those are legitimate concerns.
But still not necessarily put a financial burden on somebody who is maybe wanting to just develop a small park, but.
Sorry, no, Mike. I also really understand not wanting to do the skirting the side and saving a lot of money and doing 4x4x4 because that eventually puts the money on the taxpayer. So, I mean, if there's a way to take all three of those concepts and eloquently tie them together so that it's defined, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I definitely agree and see the concerns that Kathy, you and Rick both raised. So just something to think about, and yeah, maybe there's a way to address it, tie it all together.
So we are on the next,
One down.
yeah, we're on the next page of the PowerPoint. And we will jump to 1810, titled Lot Line Adjustments. Waiting for everybody to get there, I think.
We're going to skip. This is the one we're skipping, 1808.
1808 we're skipping, we're going to go to 1810.
It's at least a few pages further. Yeah, like 8 or 9 pages. Oh, you wrote your page? There you go.
That's why we're saving that one to the last, Steve. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a proposed, a new process for how we do lot line adjustments. It's modeled after the counties and how they do lot line adjustments with a little bit of differences. Want to first start off by saying what a lot line adjustment is and what our proposed definition of a lot line adjustment would be. We don't have the definition section yet because one of the things that we hope as we go through this is that we'll define those key terms that need definition. If we continue to, if we're asked the question, what is this mean? There may be a term that we need to define. And so the idea is to go through this and then come back with the definitions at the end to make sure that they're going to support the code that we've discussed. And one of those definitions will be for the lot line adjustment. Currently, lot line adjustments are exempted from state regulations. They give the local municipalities the opportunity to do lot line adjustments. We choose to do lot line adjustments, primarily for zoning purposes and to ensure that we're not, that someone doesn't unlawfully take away access or rights to utilities, public infrastructure of existing lots, and or make setbacks, just any situation that you can imagine not compliant with our code for all the reasons we have our codes in place. So our proposed definition of a lot line adjustment, and this was sort of, I guess you could say, the trade-off that we have talked about in our steering committees and our subcommittees, is a lot line adjustment is a minor or insignificant change of property lines associated between two or more lots with each containing a buildable area. So effectively, the easiest way to tell you the simplest scenario where that is you have two homes that are on existing lots, and they have a fence that's been there forever, and they realize that for some reason they get a survey and they're like, oh, we want to change our property line. That's a lot line adjustment. Somebody has parcels of land that by moving, they can identify to us that there are building envelopes within our code, take setbacks, take critical areas, take everything into consideration, and maybe they want to adjust the property lines a little bit. Maybe they, on one lot they want a little bigger house, and on the others they want a little smaller, or for whatever reasons they're choosing, but they're very minor and insignificant. What we don't want lot line adjustments to be anymore is what they are today, at least the way our current definition would allow it, is to take lands that potentially are completely encumbered by critical areas and to shift development from those completely encumbered critical areas to another portion of the lot where you now have far more development on one portion of the lot, and we start to look at neighborhood character. What did the neighbors anticipate would be next to them, while the others are completely unencumbered? We would view that as a short plat, because you're actually creating, while you may have 3 lots of record that meet density, you really only may have one lot that you could get a building permit on. So you're effectively increasing the number of building sites. We don't believe that those are lot line adjustments, and we don't believe that that was intent of the state subdivision regulations, because it is, by that process, you're creating building sites. So in exchange for reducing the scope of what our current processes are for a lot line adjustment, we would like to streamline the process for how you do a lot line adjustment. And essentially, if we go through this now and we start at 010, it says approval is required per this ordinance, and you're going to see some consistency now as we start to go through these chapters. And the next is it's going to talk about what the procedure is, and again, we're going to be outsourcing to our Title 21. And then we have decision criteria. Right now, in the subdivision ordinance, the lot line adjustment is the only area that has decision criteria that's really clearly defined. And one of those gives us a lot of heartache, and it's actually really difficult to satisfy, which sounds simple. I mean, it sounds really interesting for such a simple process. And it says that you must improve the overall function and utility of the lot. Sometimes just shifting a property line, you can't really say it does or doesn't. It's kind of just a neutral action. And as you can imagine, there are ways that we determine into, ways to meet that criteria, but it constantly gives us, why does it have to improve it? And why does it have to increase the functionality when there's other means and ways of adjusting property? So we've proposed to take that criteria out. Criteria 1 and 2 is effectively the same as what we have today. You can't create any additional lots, otherwise it's not a lot line adjustment, it's a short plat. They must meet the minimum zoning requirements, or what's in 1808, which is what we'll get to later. And number 3 is something that we don't have today, but we've used the function, the improve the function and utility, is that we want to make sure that they still have rights to infrastructure. So this seems like a no-brainer, but really in some proposals it's not. So we would like to at least draw that out, is that they must have legal right to public infrastructure. Number 4 is the lot line adjustment would not evade the requirements to install public improvements. And here's one that I would like to draw for you on my little sketch, because interestingly enough, it came up today in a phone conversation. And I thought, how perfect. You're going to quickly see that I am not an artist. So I am not going to give you any reference as to north-south. It doesn't really matter. So we have two existing lots of record. This is a street. This is a street. I'll put ST. We have a sewer main, and we have a water main. So what we can conclude from that is two lots abut water and street, or each lot abuts water and street, but one lot as it exists does not abut sewer. They both happen to be arterials. What our code says is that you can create pipe stem lots when you abut arterials. So what they were able to do is to draw that property line like that, where those two, that now became part of that lot. This lot now abuts sewer. It improved the overall function and utility of the lot. Sounds great. Parcel X wants to come in and they want sewer. They're now paying for sewer along the entire frontage of that lot. Where under this provision, they would not be able to do, they would be able to do a lot line adjustment like this, but they would still be installing the sewer. That is a very simple diagram, one of many situations that I can help understand or put some visual aspect to that condition.
Just to clarify, if you came in for a building permit on that other lot, you would be required to extend the sewer.
If you did not do the lot line adjustment.
That's what I'm saying. If you just had the two lots
exactly.
as is, so you're really, by doing the pipe stem, you're subverting that existing obligation.
You're yes, you are passing on this infrastructure requirement.
Yeah.
It could be the same for street, it could be the same for water. That's what corner lots are tricky. And you don't see this on the interior because you just doesn't happen. Anytime that you have corners, you have two streets, you have two sets of obligation. So hopefully that at least puts how do I get this off now? Oh, got it. Okay. So, condition number 5, starting on line 1 of the next page. Effectively, what we're looking at here is we talk about directional changes, and the directional changes are really looking at if you have a rear yards that are abutting up to rear yards, is changing that orientation where you now may have a side yard abutting to a rear yard, because there's in more traditional neighborhoods, you have side yards to side yards, you have rear yard to rear yards, and looking at the impacts of, you know, what those directional changes are. So this, I think, actually is something that came from Port Townsend, if I believe. And
Do we encounter that occasionally here?
say what?
Do we encounter that in the city?
Oh,
Yeah.
all the time. I
Yeah.
mean,
And what do we do now in that situation?
We allow it. We just ensure that that if there are existing structures on those homes, on those lots, that with the reorientation, that they're still meeting setbacks. So the front yard, if the front yard becomes a side flanking, then it would have to meet the side flanking regulations. If it's on a side flanking and now is becoming a front, it would have to meet the front yard setbacks. So we just make sure that whatever is on those lots are complying with the new lot configurations.
So this would be a little bit more restrictive than that, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
Do you see any concern, like if, I don't know, let's say a lot had frontage on an alley and a street, or it was a through lot that fronted on 2 streets, that there would be no impact, but this would restrict them from making the change?
This, this potentially, from a lot line adjustment, could, and I'm just thinking of some that we've done, where yes, Ali, we've had, you're asking me to do this again. And again, corner lots, they're always the tricky ones. So you have a scenario. You have a scenario like, I'll bring a fatter pen next time, where you have street, alley. I think this is the scenario you're talking about, and you have 2 lots. And let's say you have a house here. I can think of it, it's the Boxwood lot line adjustment. That's not healthy that I can think of this. But it was a scenario where the parking actually did not come off of the alley. It actually came off of here, off the street. So what they were able to do is to do this. So this became the lot, and this became the new lot. And in doing so, this was a side yard. Now potentially has become a rear yard, potentially. This for sure has become a rear yard, where on that side it's a side yard. That's a shift of orientation.
So could you do that? You just have to go through a short plat process to do it? Or would we not be allowed to? Because I don't know, I don't see like the harm in someone doing that as long as we address setback issues. It seems like we might create situations where we kind of stymie reasonable lot line adjustments.
And I don't think it'd be a short plat because you're not creating new lots because you have
Sure.
existing lots. Now, if that structure straddled that property line, now you only have 1 lot. Now you're into a short plat situation, which doesn't have that requirement, which is an interesting point.
It's just new, and I was curious why. I was kind of like wondering why, because I don't know if I see it as much, but maybe there's a compelling.
I think it's a good point that you raise. The intent here is to try to ensure you're maintaining that neighborhood character, and you're
Yeah.
not, creating bigger areas where they're not typically found. However, sitting here thinking about it and looking at Kathy's drawings, I mean, I can come up. We've got some areas of town that the corner lots.
Texas Street.
Yeah, Texas Street, where you've got this lot line this, the character of the street is the lots going, this way, and then on the corners, the lots all go this way. And so there may be some opportunity there where you're at least maintaining or you're consistent with the existing built neighborhood character. And so maybe there's some language there that we can pull in there that in cases where it's compatible with the existing neighborhood character, then maybe we put some of that in.
I mean,
It's a good point.
Yeah, I don't want to get too in the weeds. I don't know if
Right.
I'm like really worried about it. I was just curious, why and if so. Lisa?
So how, it's like one of those, you don't want to open up too much for interpretation, but I like the idea because I can think of a couple of places where it looks like they put the house sideways in order, on a smaller lot, and so as you go down the street, you see front, side of house, front, and the front of the house is facing someone's side, and there's not a lot of yard because everything's in the back, and it really visually is interruptive for continuity and, the aesthetics of a neighborhood, where something like this would be very appropriate. But I also understand Ally's, concern there. So is there the possibility on having something where there's that little catcher that, you know, taking into consideration the uniqueness of the lot and situation, as long as keeping within the aesthetics of the neighborhood, that you could make such an adjustment? Or is that then making everybody come and say, but I think this, you know, I want this because, I mean, it's not as clearly defined, but it would be a way to have a paragraph in there that if you did face a lot situation where it would be appropriate to have something slightly different, and that the developer can show why, you know, it really is for betterment of the neighborhood instead of detrimental in order to be able to develop it. Could you put a paragraph in that would allow that?
No, they're all good points. I think we can definitely take a look
Right.
at this section a little bit more.
Right.
I just had two quick questions on the criteria. And on number 2, I think this strikes at what I brought up earlier in the general provisions. The adjustment may not further the nonconforming standard. So what if you have 2 lots that are nonconforming and you have a lot line adjustment that's like you described, like someone built their fence 3 feet off where it's supposed to be, and someone buys it and does a survey and finds out, and they go, well, I want to fix this, and both lots are nonconforming. So if you move that line, you're making that nonconforming lot more nonconforming. I encounter that a lot professionally in the county, all the time. And they have a restriction on that was put in place 4 or 5 years ago, and I see like poor unsuspecting homeowners punished all the time, where we have to go to the court and file an adverse possession claim and go through a court and pay a bunch of money to do something that's like both parties agree to, and it's not like a significant reduction in the size of the lot. It might be a foot or two, but this seems like it would prohibit that from occurring. And I don't know, is there a way to get around that? And I know that the exemptions say a division by court order, but I wonder, I just see like innocent people get hurt by that a lot in the county.
Agreed. And right now, the code says you cannot make a lot any smaller than what previously existed. And we went to court on that, went to Court of Appeals, and we won on that decision. However, I'm with you on that. So what we've done, and we didn't have the ability to do this, and trust me that at least when we get to 1804, I know you'll hold that thought, but under minimum lot size, under lot line adjustment, it says lots that are non-conforming to site area may be further reduced to no less than 90% of the smallest lot.
Okay, so you're picking it up that way. So if there's that kind of issue,
Yeah.
we can get around that.
That's right.
That's a great way
Because
to deal
that
with
becomes
it.
the minimum lot size.
Is that in 1808?
Yes.
Okay, that's a great way to
Yes.
deal with it. Thank you. And then the last thing was on number 3. I was jumping to 1808. 1808-050C is the lot where you're talking about pipe stems and frontage, and it basically says you don't have to front a butt on public infrastructure, but this decision criteria says all resulting lots have legal access to improve right-of-way and abutment on public infrastructure. And I'm wondering if there's a consistency issue between decision criteria 3 and that proposal in 1808-050 that says you don't have to do that anymore. And so that's more just like a grammar, and does that create some inconsistency? Maybe that should say and abutment on public infrastructure as defined in 1808-050C or something. And that was just something I was thinking about because I was paying a lot of attention to that section in 1808.
No, that's not the intent, but that's the
Yeah.
reason is how is it being read, so that's helpful.
And so that was just an observation.
Yep. Okay. So now we're getting into the process. Review of the application and approval of the approve and or denial. We actually don't see many denials because we're hoping we do enough front counter work to where the denials walk away before they make applications so we don't have to deny. That we would review the application, issue a decision, and they would have the opportunity to do some, to apply for variances and/or administrative modifications. It seems odd that we get variances with lot line adjustments, but on a few occasions we do. It's not as frequent as short plats, but there will also be an opportunity that we'll talk about later for the administrative modifications. And then once we grant final approval, this is where our proposed change is. I'll explain what we do today, and then explain what the differences are. So today, when anyone asks what's the difference between a lot line adjustment and a short plat, I say from process, really nothing. Because right now, what an applicant would do once they have preliminary approval is they'd go out, they would survey the property, which they will still do under the new. They'll submit what we call check prints, which are they're draft documents of the Mylar document that would ultimately be recorded at the auditor's office. And the surveyor prepares those, they submit them to the city, we review them. Once we approve the check prints, they then prepare Mylars, and then the city signs those, the applicant, property owner sign those, and then they get filed at the auditor's office. For reasons I've never asked how much that costs, but I know that filing Mylars, the Mylar document itself, the creation of the Mylar, and the filing is a rather expensive endeavor when we're really trying to get a picture, and that's what we provide for public notice is what the lots look like. So what we're proposing is that it would still require the property to be surveyed, but we would create a form, a paper document that would effectively be our lot line adjustment approval, and attached to that would be legal descriptions of the existing parcels, the proposed parcels, and the areas to be adjusted. And together with that, we would also have the conveyance documents. Because what we are finding is that when some of these lot line adjustments are being filed, there are no conveyance documents that are being recorded with them. And that's troublesome. And so when we presented this to the steering committees and to the subcommittee, we asked, are we overreaching by asking for those conveyance documents? And we've asked all broad spectrums of those who are involved in this process, and they said absolutely not. Now, we are not drafting those conveyance documents. We are simply reviewing them to ensure that the legal descriptions on those documents will match our approval document. Are they the same, and are the maps the same? That will be our role in the conveyance documents, but the goal is try to get the recording of the lot line adjustment document and the conveyance documents done at the same time. So, two major differences. No longer Mylars, and we are asking for the submittal of the conveyance documents. So those are our two processes. We believe this is going to be a much faster process, an expedited process, with just a lot of simplicity to it.
Kathy? Sorry. So the idea here would be that you would have two separate documents, a recording document and a conveyance deed?
Yes.
Is there any way that we could combine 2 and 3 into the conveyance deed and just say, because that's what they do in the county, you file a conveyance deed that includes all A, B, I like this. This is a great approach to lot line adjustments in general, but 2 A, B, and C are just exhibits to the conveyance deed, and then you pay less recording fees.
Are they always attached though?
Yeah, their preliminary lot line adjustment approval document says, in order for final approval, you must provide deeds with the following exhibits, and it lists these 3 things as the exhibits to the deed.
So then what is their authority then for, what we had discussed was not getting into the business of those conveyance documents being the city's documents, and having the ability to review them as our approval document and not, so
it works either way.
And maybe that's a conversation we need to have with the title companies to see if we're going to run into any issues. I'm open.
Yeah.
completely open to that idea and to explore that further.
The county does get,
That-
they put a stamp on
Right.
it, and that's how they deal with that. So you have to take it out, and they actually put this red stamp
Yeah.
that says, we've reviewed and approved, and they sign it, the stamp. So you're right. I was just thinking it saves someone $75, because every document costs $75 to record. So,
No, I can,
But
we can
if
definitely look
not-
into that.
If not, just generally, I think this is a much easier way, even with 2 documents, it's a much easier way to deal with it than a Mylar. So I really like the concept in general.
I honestly have always wondered how the title companies are allowing a municipality to stamp their documents when they're
Yeah,
insured.
after everybody
and-
signed it.
Yeah, I find that to be really interesting, but,
Bring it out afterwards and they stamp it.
so I don't know. I just, yeah. So here is something new in 060, and we don't currently have this. And again, this is intended that if we're simplifying the process, trying to move the process along to make sure the process that they don't stall, is implementing effectively an expiration date that if it's not filed within a certain amount of time, it's null and void. So things can't just hang out there. They need to know what they want to do, and they need to be timely, and they need to be ready to do that. OAO is something you're going to see consistently throughout. In the other documents, or in the other processes for short plats and final plats and binding site plans, we're still required to do Mylar documents. That's state regulation, but we will no longer, we're proposing that we no longer receive a copy of the Mylar document, and we just want a PDF copy of the recorded Mylar. And again, it's an unnecessary expense, because I hate to break this, but we get the Mylars and they immediately go to archives, because all the information that we're using is digital that comes from DNR. So we don't need it anymore. Our code requires it. So in the state, we've talked to DNR, and DNR says that we can do an electronic PDF copy. So again, trying to get rid of that waste. Do we want to try to go through short plats?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
let's do it.
There will be some redundancies that if you've gone through thoroughly enough, you've seen between short plats and preliminary plats. So some of what we discussed today, I mean, we can certainly rehash next time, but don't know if it'll be necessary. The current subdivision ordinance right now has a separate chapter for cluster subdivisions. And it's really strange that you have a subdivision section, or you have a short plat section, you have a preliminary plat section, and then you have a cluster. Well, a cluster is really nothing more than a preliminary plat with a different set of development standards. But interestingly enough, there's also a cluster short plat that is somewhat buried at the very end of the cluster section. So what we are proposing is to eliminate that cluster chapter and to incorporate the cluster short plats into the short plat section and put the cluster preliminary plats into the preliminary plat section. And we'll get to some of those provisions later, but it seemed to fundamentally make sense to us, and the separate chapter didn't seem to be applicable or necessary. So what you'll see under the sections is like we did in the lot line adjustment, you're going to start to see some consistencies where approval required, you have some procedures, decision criteria, review, minor modifications. Those are all consistent so far, what the effective decision. So we're going to start to see a lot of consistency now as we move forward. And that's in part when we talk about we're not changing substance, it's how it's written and how it's organized is some of the major differences of this code. So when we go through procedures, those are predominantly straight out of our existing Title 21 but we're outsourcing again, saying what you have to do specifically within each. You have to go to Title 21. Under 020A1, this is where we start to talk about a short cluster subdivision, and it does require the same process as a preliminary plat. It is not administrative. If there is extreme opposition, and also if they use the cluster provisions, which is also in the preliminary plat section. One of the things that I want to ask for your opinion is under number B, under 020B, our speak of subdivisions is very lazy, and we use a lot of generic terms, where the proper way of referring to the act of subdividing the property is a subdivision, but we typically think of subdivision as something much larger, but really a two-lot short plat is a two-lot short subdivision. A short plat is really nothing more than the drawing, but we're lazy in our speak, and we use them interchangeably, and they can be confusing. One is a map, one is a process. We would like to be able to use them interchangeably, and that's what B is saying, so that we can talk in generic kind of layman terms as we do. I'm doing a two-lot short plat. No, actually, you're doing a two-lot short subdivision. So it's more of how we interact, and we're just trying to bring some everyday reference to the code. If you think it's not necessary, we can do that too, or we can not include it. It just, for some reason, seemed important. C is required by state law. It's just a notification requirement. D is also required by state law, and it talks about floodplains, and again, it's a notification requirement. Those are verbatim, straight out of code. Decision criteria, this is brand new. Currently, the short plat and preliminary plat sections do not, within our code, have any decision criteria. Number 5 and number 6 of both short plats and preliminary plats are straight out of state law. So those are the two findings and decision criteria that we are required to do by state law. So effectively, we are asking your consideration of the first 4 to be included in our decision. One kind of goes back to the very purpose statement of the subdivision ordinance, and that is finding compliance with this title, the comp plan, and the municipal and the entire municipal code. Number 2, it takes you back to 18, which is we're going to talk about lot width, we're going to talk about street access, we're going to talk about utilities and all those kinds of fundamental things. Number 3, Lisa, this gets to most of what you're talking about. So again, this is for short plats and for preliminary plats. And again, there will be more in 1808 that broadens this. But really looking at that orderly extension of public infrastructure. It's in Title 13, kind of, but that doesn't help when it's not in Title 18. So that's why we really want to draw, and it's good design, and that's, when you look at other municipalities, it's in their provisions, so it definitely seemed prudent to do that. And then number 4, I actually had someone suggest to me in a short plat that they were able to create lots that weren't buildable. And they said, show me where it says I can. And it kind of was one of those moments where you're like, oh, but then you step back and you go, well, really, there's a good reason why what we're trying to do. And again, this furthers the purpose statement of what we're trying to do. So again, this set of 6 criteria is meant to apply to both short plats and preliminary plats. So they're applicable on a very small scale, but they're also applicable on a very large scale. Any questions on those? B is straight out of state law, and the only thing I want to draw your attention to, because I think it's pretty fun, is on line 38. Proposed subdivisions may be denied because of flood, inundation, or swamp. State law still, and it's swamp, that's what state law says, so that's what we're keeping. Don't worry, there's other critical area comments within this as well. They don't say ditch, but they do say swamp, so. And then again, section C is just saying that, of course, there's an opportunity for administrative modification and variances. So that's just it's an upfront. Again, this is meant for the user as they're reading through this, as well as staff. Review and approval process, I already noticed on number B under 40040, it says lot line adjustment. It should say short plat because we're starting to get into these consistencies, and that was an error of a cut and paste on my part.
That's the same as C from the prior section. Is that intentional? Or is that like a misprint? So you've got that under decision criteria and under review and approval process. And I didn't look to see where you have it later in the document.
It shouldn't be under C. We should delete it under C. That would make most sense. But
should,
make it short plat.
It should be in the decision criteria, but not the review and approval process.
I think it should be under review and approval process and not under the decision.
I see. Okay, yeah. I think that's how you have it in the long plat
Yes.
stuff.
Thank you.
Okay.
So effectively, the application comes in, we'll review it against the criteria, and we'll issue a decision. And the decision will either be to approve with conditions, or deny. Once the applicant gets that decision in writing, there's a couple different steps that they will do, and that moves us down to 050. Where we talk about application procedures for final plat, short plat approval, for final short plat approval. If the application has conditions, say they need to construct parking or they need to do public infrastructure improvements, if there's some condition of approval that requires action and or a subsequent permit, they do that together and while they're doing their surveying and preparing their check prints, which again, we talked about check prints, which are the draft copies of the Mylar or the plat drawing. And we go through those processes. And then what we will do, and which we don't have right now, is under section B, is it talks about basically the steps that need to happen in order to obtain final plat approval. So we go through is A, the check prints have to conform to state law and to this title, and there will be a section coming forward. We need to ensure that all conditions of the preliminary approval have been met and, most importantly, accepted by the city, because they can complete a street, but it's not, until the city accepts it, that condition hasn't been met. And then if there are any infrastructure improvements, is bringing in record drawings for the city's use of what those are, and that's just step within their process. And then if there's any financial sureties associated with that, they would bring those in, any required easements and deeds. This is a really large catch-all list of what a proposal could have within it. Not all of them are like this. More often than not, they just have check prints and they go straight to Mylar. But again, it's meant for people to use as they go through this. And a lot of this will go to a final subdivision application so that they can see what steps they will need to do. It's like a checklist. And then once we determine that the conditions are met, they'll prepare Mylars, and then those Mylars will be signed by appropriate city departments. They'll get filed, and then they will return a copy to us. The interesting thing about, the one thing I really want to note here, and this section is currently under legal review as well, and that legal review will come out when we have the public hearing, if not sooner. But under 1812-080, effective and approved final short plat, there's a court decision that was that said that short plats are vested in perpetuity forever to whatever rules and regulations that were in place at the time of the short plat application. There's one that since that has come out in 2015 that didn't overturn that, but add a little bit of clarity to that decision and narrowed it a bit. And it really talked about the vesting is attributed to the activity that is associated with the short plat application. So what we're providing in here as our first attempt at drafting this is that it says under line 40, in accordance with this title shall vest in a, take out the, in a, it's not man or, it's manner, to the anticipated uses disclosed in the original short plat application. And that's what the recent court case has provided guidance and direction. So for example, you have a short plat that has 2 lots. One of them is built on immediately. You have critical areas. The other's not built on for 10 years. If they disclosed that they're for single-family home development, then we will review the vested right of them to be able to come in with a single-family building permit on the lot that wasn't built on. Take the house or the lot where the house was built immediately. Now they want to come in with an outbuilding. If that was not previously disclosed and or anticipated, and or they want to do a retaining wall, and or they want to do a massive addition or something of that nature, the question that latest court case asked is, should they really be vested to anything and forever and in perpetuity? And effectively it put on some limitations, but it's not clear as to what those limitations are, but it talked about the use that is disclosed in the application. So we're building off of that, but yet, again, this is still under our legal review to see if this is catching what that court decision said. Does that help? Is that clear? Okay. 1812-100, and again, this is going to be duplication to preliminary plat. And this is the ability to do minor modifications to an approved short plat. So this is not asking for a departure from a provision. This is asking for, you have an approval and you want to modify it in some way. It happens, it doesn't happen often, it happens more in preliminary plats, but we're always faced with the question, is this a new application? Should we put them through the new, or can we really amend it? And we just really don't have clear direction right now or guidance. And so this is trying to help us with that guidance. In a preliminary plat right now, we really use the hearing examiner's order, and we have very vague language in our existing regulations. So this will help us define when is it consistent enough that we should do a minor modification, or when do we believe it's significant enough where it requires a new application. So again, we believe it should comply with all provisions of the chapter. The modification doesn't involve the alteration or the vacation of any city easements, roads, or city-owned lands. There's no substantial changes to the neighborhood or the city as a result of the change. And again, this is for think larger and broader too for the preliminary plat, because I wanted to make them as consistent, interchangeable for both. Modification will not increase the number of lots. And what that means specifically in the context of the short plat is that if you do a 4-lot short plat, you're required to have minimum street standard improvements. If you do a 5-lot short plat, you're required to do 3/4, which means curb, gutter, sidewalk. So if you have a 4-lot short plat approval, and now you want to, and for some reason you made the lots bigger and you want to come in and do a 5-lot, well, it not only requires different conditions of approval, it also requires a different process, because now we have to send out notice. So this gives us the ability to say, nope, you're definitely into a different application. And then it will not significantly alter any condition of approval associated with the first one.
One of the key reasons behind this one is when you're doing subdivisions and smaller short plots like this, you don't get into the details of the construction standards of a street or a utility main extension, because that really takes quite a bit of money, time, engineering to go forward with that. So what they're doing is they're going out and putting it down on paper, getting a good idea of what's going to happen, and then when they go in and start to do the engineering drawings, we've found that there's little tweaks that need to be made, and this really helps define that, and it gives us these, it gives criteria in which we can approve these versus not really knowing what the right step and appropriate process is. So.
And we currently, because we don't have a defined process, we will be establishing an application for this, and there will be a review fee, assuming it will be a minor application. But it's establishing more of a formal process for something that's been very informal over the years.
And I like C though, because I could see where somebody continues to make minor adjustments.
Yes.
And extending their time.
Right.
So when I read that, I was like,
Yeah.
that's a good catch.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'm impressed, actually.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions on that specific chapter?
No, but I have clarification before we.
Just generally? I have one comment. I think this is really good. Like both these chapters, you can see they're practical and they're logical, and I like reading through and seeing consistent presentation in each subsection that, like you've talked about, that helps a lot. So generally, like I had very little comment on this at all. My only comment is on the procedures section where we, in 020A1, so when you're in a short cluster subdivision, and I understand what we're trying to do here with when the director determines there's significant planning issues or significant neighborhood opposition to the proposal, because we're trying to capture those cluster projects where they might generate concern, because cluster projects are they feel denser sometimes, they're more maybe burden like one side of the property more. So I see that. I would ask that we consider using different language than neighborhood opposition to the proposal. That's not a defined term, so it's going to have to be a judgment call by the director when what is significant neighborhood opposition. And I just feel like that's a negative tone. It's a negative presentation of the intent, and the intent is when people are interested in the project, when there's enough interest. And I feel like we have enough negativity in our discourse regarding land use planning, and this reinforces that a little bit, and it might encourage like the community who has concern about a proposal to go out and like, we're opposed to this, and rabble rouse. And I think, I was just brainstorming, I think if you said if there are significant planning issues or significant community interest in the proposal, that's the exact same effect, but it delivers a different tone. Mm-hmm. We're concerned about people being interested in the project, and it affects the community. And so I know we've dealt with that a lot over the past few years, and I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, but I think that's a better way to present that.
I think that's actually the same language in our planned permit section when we send out
community
notice to
interest,
the planning commission chair gets to determine. I think it's significant planning issues or
community
interest or something like that. So I think it's very.
I just feel like it's a better presentation, and people might
That's a really
still
good
be,
point.
that community interest might materialize in neighborhood opposition,
Sure.
but at least we're not setting that tone right out the gates.
No, that's good.
So
That's
that's
really
just that was my only comment on this entire section.
I think that same idea can be carried over to the alteration process too, because there's an optional hearing process for that as well. And so the same idea, because that's the idea, is we're looking at interest.
We want to respect that concern from
Right.
the community without a doubt.
Right. Nope, I
Just in the
totally
right way.
appreciate that.
So, Lisa, general comment?
Well, just my own clarification. Going back to our October meeting, there was an area, and I guess part of it is I just can't remember if it was the cluster short division or if it was just a short division, but we were talking about that we were interested in it in the sense that it was applicable to Greenfield versus infill. And I would like to have a better idea as I go back and actually read this for the third time, of each of these categories, what you would envision, not necessarily like holistically 100%, but where would we be applying some of these as far as being infill, and what would we be applying more as Greenfield? Just so that I go back with another lens and make sure I'm looking at it correctly.
Yeah, and primarily that topic comes up when we start to talk about design standards and infrastructure improvements, because the processes that we're talking about can be applied anywhere. But what I can help share with you when we talk about Greenfield, just not given the fact, but most of our infrastructure deficiencies are on the periphery of the city for reasons that they haven't gotten there yet, but they're also the most topographically and most geographically and they're the most difficult parcels. That's mostly what we refer to as Greenfield Development, where there is no development right now. So typically, you're not going to see short plats in those sections or lot line adjustments. You're typically going to see the plats, the preliminary plats. How you do the development within those is really where 1808 is going to come in and talk about what uses potentially we can consider there, what the lots can look like. Do they need to be of the same size that you have in your traditional established neighborhoods? And then we're looking at lot widths and lot depths in our traditional neighborhoods where we get more of the infill type development, and like where the infill toolkit becomes a use in some of those other scenarios. So yes, definitely. And if you want that for the next, because we won't get to 1808 by the next, if you want it before that, definitely that can be done and put into a memo, or we can include that in our presentation.
Well, I was just going to say, I remember distinctly our context on that was, can we have greater flexibility? And we said if it was big enough to be able to make transition on the outside to allow the inside to do that. And that's in the standards that you'll be seeing coming forward.
And that's where we were getting into the 90% and 80% and all of
Yes.
that. And I took a lot of notes on that. But I'm just thinking, you know, in people in established neighborhoods that have large lots, there's that concern that, you know, as far as subdivision has been a little bit of a hot topic because of the concern of potentially somebody going in and, you know, buying up contiguous lots and then utilizing some of this to be able to develop where it wouldn't be in the character of the neighborhood, or people would lose their backyard because of how houses are placed versus street front, you know. So some of this stuff is addressing limiting the potential impact, but I do think it's going to be really critical to identify when people come forward and they're afraid someone's going to buy 6 lots on a part of a block and big backyards, and someone's going to put a pipe stem, and they're going to, you know, do various things, how you're going to be able to show that, you know, that may not be able to happen in certain areas because, you know, of how it has to be fronted, or this would be how this development is going to be impacting those areas, whether it can happen, and if it can, what that possibly look like. And I know we don't necessarily want to use overlays of particular neighborhoods because that can be quite a, you know, a reactionary thing, especially if I looked up and I saw it was my property as an example. That probably wouldn't go over very well because, you know, nobody wants to see that. Yeah, well, you could use mine because I'm on a corner lot with a very unique area. But, you know, you might be able to put one more house on there. But I guess part of it is as you look at all of this, you can see potential in developed neighborhoods in just about all of this, except for some large development. But I think identifying, you know, because, you know, we all know what neighborhoods potentially could be impacted by improper infill. And there should be proper infill, and I think we need to be prepared for that. But I know some of the stuff that we talked about, we said, you know, you had great examples on, you know, how we would have, you know, this new development would be more greenfield because we'd be able to still have, you know, houses facing the established neighborhood, still mirror being the same, but behind it we could get very creative. But I think it's that aspect of how we're using some of these tools to be creative. We need to make sure we're defining, can that happen even though, you know, within that existing neighborhood? And if not, what in here actually prevents that from happening? Because I have people who are, you know, in the grocery store stopping and saying something, and it's like, hey, just keep paying attention. So I don't know if anybody else is hearing things on this, but for me, it would help, be useful to know.
And we definitely intend to have full transparency in those areas where we know there will be potential infill opportunities that currently don't exist today because with existing situations, because we need people to understand that, obviously, and you as making recommendations need to understand that. And when we get into the lot standards, there will be a lot of information to hopefully help understand, what happens if we get rid of the pipe stems, the requirement for street frontage. For example, and we are going to do an overlay of the Birchwood neighborhood and the Columbia neighborhood, and why are we going to do that? Because right now the subdivision ordinance has a very strict requirement as to what can happen there. So if we're going to lift that, we need to understand what those impacts are going to be. So we are going to go to the neighborhood level. At the same time, when we go to the Greenfield level, we're going to look at what areas are zone cluster. And what do these do to these areas, and are these appropriate locations? So we're going to get to the neighborhood level. We're going to get to some lot specifics, but that's to show bad examples, and we're going to show good examples of things that have happened that we don't believe should happen, and why they shouldn't happen. And then we're going to look at opportunities, and a lot of the opportunities is where the infill comes in.
Personally, I think there's a lot of great opportunity to have good infill. But I think we really need to be able to show how this is going to be a tool to achieve that. But we're also going to have to show how there are measures in here that are going to prevent that bad infill. Because I think if you can balance that for the public, I think people will be excited about the opportunities. It's that potential for that unseen or unforeseen, like, boy, I didn't think that would happen, that we need to really make sure we're careful on.
It may be a size relationship, because quite frankly, if I said you needed 5 acres as a minimum to do it, it would be highly unlikely someone would buy 5 acres in the city to facilitate that, just the cost. But I think it would be plausible to think that someone would buy 5 acres that are Greenfield or greater to be able to do that kind of size plat. And just by that bar, you might be able to allow greater latitude with comfort. And then on things that are smaller, it might be restricted in how much you can alter.
Again, a lot of people out there, they're not as knowledgeable as you or experienced as the people, I'm not experienced, so, I'll consider myself one of them in that aspect. I've learned a lot, and that has helped a lot to ease some of the concerns that I'm hearing, like, you have to learn some of this, but I think it's going to be really an important component to communicate. You guys are doing great, but not everybody's participated yet to this point, so I think I'd just be prepared to come with those specific examples and front load that. And I know I've said that before, but it's just because it's coming up. I think there's a good opportunity, like you said, size, the likelihood of somebody buying 5 acres. Knowledge like that up front is going to definitely calm some of the concerns that people are having.
I think it's definitely just as important for us that we want to try to avoid those unintended consequences. And this hopefully is the process that will weed some of those out, because there's nothing in here meant to create those. But Ali's already brought up some things, and you've brought up in the discussions of it's a different way of thinking. I mean, you get so into something, it's good to have someone on the outside to ask those critical questions. And we don't own this. This is going to be the city's document. So we're always open to ideas and comments.
A lot of really good, truly good opportunity, and can really move, help with the infill. Just probably most of things that are coming up, I think this is probably one of the most critical changes that we're going to be making to assist with that tool. Anyway,
Thank you.
All right. No, well, thank you guys all. I know Kathy especially, and you put a lot of work into this, so, and Rick and Kurt helping answer these questions, and I think we'll move through it in a similar fashion at the next meeting, and everyone else will kind of probably seamlessly fit right into it, and hopefully they'll have a chance to go back and watch this, but appreciate it. So I think with that, we'll close our discussion portion of the work session. Public comment. Dick, would you like to make a comment tonight? No. You waited through all that. No. Nothing? Great. Yeah, and I appreciate that, and definitely, I think we want to hear from, eventually from you and anyone else who's interested in watching. We will have a public hearing at some point where there's going to be a focus on listening, so, yeah, definitely. Thank you.
One thing to say about that, and again, it's good to see people participating in these meetings, and if you are hearing things about that, it would be really beneficial if you get to have those people talk to us now so that we can work through it as we're going through some of these, bring up some of these ideas, and we can start to discuss them instead of at the last minute after we've done a lot of work. So we're really having these work sessions. I think we want to know what the citizens are thinking, and having people attend these hearings or meetings is important for us so that we understand exactly what people are thinking.
I think people right now are in the learning mode in the comfort of their home with a cat and a cup of tea.
Yeah.
So.
Can I do that?
Yeah.
Nice.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you very much. I don't think do we have any old or new business to talk about? We talked about the marijuana ordinance being shifted, and our next meeting is next week, next Thursday, and it's going to be about the stormwater regulations, right? Low impact development. Is that going to be a public hearing?
It's the start of one, yes.
Yeah, so we'll start the public hearing on that. And so we'll get presented with kind of at the last meeting, it was just kind of like, here's the ideas, but this will be an actual draft ordinance. Is that the idea?
Yep, that's what we're hoping.
Okay.
Materials soon.
Cool. That's great.
And
So
it's the starting of it. There's been some recent Supreme Court decisions that have
muddy those waters.
A little bit,
Yeah. So it's not anticipated that we'll rock through that and finish next week. That'll be an introduction, chance for public comment, and then we'll be able to just proceed.
Yep.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Steve, yeah.
Hey, I'd like to compliment Dick for sitting in one of those chairs for 2 hours straight.
Yeah, very impressive.
Anybody that's ever sat out there knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
When we'd come back next to keep moving on.
Oh,
this.
yeah,
And
thank you.
It's dependent on a couple of things that are before you, the storm and the marijuana. If those things are moving to resolution, it gives us an open opportunity. We'll give you plenty of time to know.
But not before mid-February, because we won't be piggybacking more of this on any of the other meetings we've got.
It's unlikely.
Maybe, because we had talked about, maybe with marijuana, we'd have enough time after. So I think some of that's going to be our judgment call as to the timing. Oh, I thought he ended it, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're still on record.
Would you like me to repeat that? Okay. I think some of that will just be our call of not trying to overload and shift gears too much and making sure we have sufficient time to get through sufficient information. I don't know. Maybe just one chapter isn't really good flow, if you only get through one chapter. So I think those are some things we'll need to talk about.
No rush. All right, well, thank you. With that, we will adjourn. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.